Good afternoon, everybody. It is lovely to see you again in person now for 2 months in a row. So that's wonderful, and again, welcome to the World Affairs Council of the Monterey Bay Area. I'm Glenn Robinson, the president for 2 more months, and then I won't be anymore. Thank you very much. Let me make a couple of admin announcements before I introduce our speaker for the day. So we do have some upcoming events I'd like to draw your attention to. Tomorrow, Dr. Richard Haass, who's the longtime president of the Council on Foreign Relations and sort of one of the foreign policy gurus in the Washington establishment, will be giving a talk, a digital talk, via Zoom at 11 o'clock in the morning, and this is a very exciting new venture by the World Affairs Councils of California. All but San Francisco, they want to remain apart for some reason, but everybody else has come together to co-sponsor this talk by Richard Haass. The talk is free. You are all welcome, and I encourage you to attend. You do have to register for it in order to get the Zoom link. So you can just go to our website, wacmb.org, wacmb.org, and follow the link. It's right there on the home page. The Los Angeles chapter of the World Affairs Council is handling the logistics, so you'll be directed to their page, but you'll have an opportunity to say that you're from the Monterey World Affairs Council as you register for the talk. So I encourage you all to do that. He's a brilliant guy. And the title of his talk tomorrow is U.S. Foreign Policy Amid Global Crisis, and it'll be moderated by Dr./Colonel Richard Downey. Again, that's Richard Haass, President of the Council on Foreign Relations. So encourage you all to tune into that. Again, register today. You'll get the link, and you can watch it tomorrow at 11. Next month, on April 29th, will be our April luncheon. And we will have Ambassador Stephen Pfeiffer, who's currently at Stanford University. Cal didn't want him, I guess. Never mind, inside joke. But it's a very exciting opportunity. Ambassador Pfeiffer is the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine from 1998 to 2000. In fact, for a number of years, he was one of the top American officials for Ukraine and Russia, both as ambassador at the State Department, the National Security Council, as well for the 1996 to 2004 period. Again, he was one of our top experts on Ukraine and Russia in the government. So that should be a very exciting talk. Again, April 29th, mark your calendars. Also, an encouragement, our discussion groups continue apace. If you're not participating in any of the discussion groups, again, I'd encourage you to do that. Go to our website and get more information about the discussion groups. Typically linked, or at least often linked to the speakers that we have. This is a chance for you to get together and say, what was Dr. Twomey thinking when he said that? And have a discussion about it. Also on our website, again, we did over 30, I think it was 31 was the final count of these short talks, quick takes during the pandemic when we could not meet in person. And those were all, of course, recorded, and they are all on our website as well. So a lot of these typically were 15 to 20 minutes. And I'd encourage you to go back and review some of those of topics of particular interest to you. Just put on our website is on, again, so you can find it on the front page, bottom right corner, member resources. And this is kind of a new experiment we're doing. So last month's talk by Professor Tom Johnson at the Naval Postgraduate School is there, and this is for members only. So it's very easy. You just click on a link. It will generate an email for you to get the passcode. So you don't have to do very much. And that way, if you missed Tom Johnson's talk or want to re-listen to it, this is just for members, and you can go on our website and get that information. And another experiment that we're trying today is after the talk, Doug Rogers, Doug, make yourself aware, you all know Doug Rogers, he will have a microphone in hand, and he'd love to get little snippets and input from you on how you enjoyed today's luncheon. You know, the food, the speaker, no bad comments about the president, those are not allowed. This is, I'm sorry, that's Moscow, never mind. But anyway, so seek out Doug, or he might seek out you, and just again give us some feedback, give us some input that we can learn from you. All right, I think that is all my admin stuff. So let me get to the main event. Dr. Christopher Twomey, to my right here, will be talking today on how the China-Taiwan conflict could intensify U.S.-China competition. And just my own little insert here that while all eyes are currently on Ukraine, and rightfully so, Taiwan could very well be the next Ukraine, with even more profound implications, I think, certainly for this country and its foreign policy, and perhaps even globally. Dr. Twomey is an associate professor in the Department of National Security Affairs at NPS. He has been at NPS since 2004, so this is his 18th year. Before then, he received his PhD from MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, in political science. In addition to his academic work, he works closely with the Department of Defense and the State Department on a range of diplomatic and security matters. His book, The Military Lens, Doctrinal Differences and Deterrence Failure in Sino-American Relations, focuses on how the differences in military doctrines between the U.S. and China play out in important diplomatic and security domains, often leading to misunderstood signals, one to the other, between these two superpowers. Prior to coming to NPS, he has previously taught or researched at Harvard, Boston College, RAND, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, UC San Diego, and the University of California's Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation. He speaks and reads Chinese and has lived in and traveled to China and the region around China on a regular basis. As we did last time, we will, of course, have a period of Q&A. Elizabeth Robinson right here, who turns 29 today, by the way. Birthday girl. She will have the mic, so just raise your hand. She will keep a hold of the mic so we're not passing around the mic from hand to hand, given that we're still dealing with COVID. So again, if you do have a question, raise your hand and she will find you. And with that, please help me in welcoming Dr. Christopher Twomey.
Thanks, Glenn. Let's see, this is hopefully warming up. Thanks very much, Glenn. Appreciate the introduction. Pleasure to talk to everybody here. This is, I think, a really important topic that when we were arranging to talk about something China-related, I do think that this is the most important kind of issue set to talk about. So the usual disclaimer of, since I work for the Navy School, make sure I'm clear that I'm giving you my views, not those of the Navy or the Department of Defense. In fact, I'm not the one who speaks for the family. That responsibility is held by my wife. So I'll be giving you just my personal views on this issue set. A second kind of asterisk of opening comments here is there are certainly other important areas of competition between the U.S. and China. And we could have a productive discussion, as I do with my students, about the South China Sea, about the Senkaku Islands, about the Sino-Indian border dispute. All of those are important areas, but none are as important as Taiwan, which, well, we had it before. There we are. I can see it. I just got to find my mouse. And I got the mouse, and we're there. Excellent. So that's kind of my second little bit of context is there are other areas that we can talk about. I just don't think they're as important. And then my third little caveat to get started here is I think it is important to differentiate China and Russia. These are fundamentally very different powers, different patterns of engagement in the world, different situation within the international economy, within their own self-conception, right? And there's a great Rand report that talks about Russia as a rogue state, but China as a near-peer competitor, right? And so it's not universally better to be dealing with China than Russia, but it is very different. And I think we need to keep that in mind because there are things we're going to need to do with China, in partnership with China, alongside the strategic competition that comes out of sort of the era of great power competition. So that perspective that there's value in working with China on some issues, like North Korea, given the ICBM test of the last few days, Iran, others, mean that handling the Taiwan issue becomes really important. We can't just simply promote U.S. interests without regard to Chinese views. And so what I'm going to do kind of over the next, 35 minutes, is kind of walk through how the three different players all contribute to making this a particularly challenging problem. It's not solely Chinese aggression. But there are other factors going on, and it's the interaction of the three that makes me really worry. So we'll start out talking a little bit about kind of Taiwan, why it's important to the United States, to the world, then talk a little bit about Chinese policy towards Taiwan, which is long-standing and I think quite robust, but then kind of raise the U.S. evolution in policy, which some of you will have been involved in and know intimately, but others may not. And then kind of step back and ask how those all interact. So, I often think of this little triangle talking about a couple of different factors. A shifting military balance between the U.S. and China. Not any domestic politics in the Chinese case, but domestic factors have evolved over time. Massive economic growth has brought China from, in 1989, China represented 5% of U.S. GDP. Today, 70% of U.S. GDP. That gives them, of course, attendant both geo-economic but also military capabilities. Taiwan, too, though, also has both a historic relationship with the United States, but also some significant domestic politics. So, yeah, this triangular relationship, I think, is kind of an important way of thinking through. But let's start out talking a little bit about Taiwan. Many of you will know we had a formal alliance with Taiwan until 1979. They were our close security partner in the early part of the Cold War. We deliberately shifted recognition in the 1970s to serve a broader strategic goal of competition with the Soviet Union. By complicating the Soviet-Chinese relationship, we achieved significant advantage. In fact, that's one of the important, I think, sources of the end of the Cold War, is that the Soviets were bankrupted not so much by Star Wars, the missile defense system, but by having to compete with both the Chinese and the United States. When we tore up the alliance, we kind of hit the nadir of U.S.-Taiwan relations in 1979 and into the 80s. But nevertheless, we have a continued diplomatic engagement with them, not as a country, but nevertheless as a important partner. And we'll kind of come back to that point in a second. They're our 9th biggest trading partner. They have, let me look at my notes here. They have 10 times the GDP per person of the Ukraine. right? They're 10 times as wealthy as the Ukrainians individually. I was just reading stories today about the Russians kind of calling back home from the Ukraine, commenting about how well off the Ukrainians are. Taiwan, much better off, although only about half the population. But that gives you some sense of, if Ukraine is important, Taiwan is going to be significantly more important. It also sits at a really important bit of strategic geography. A little washed out, sorry. But you can just make out Taiwan here in the middle. And then the yellow line is, Chinese kind of refer to that as the first island chain. So running from Japan through the Ryukyus, across to Taiwan, and then across the Philippines and into the South China Sea, where things get a little bit vaguer. Taiwan kind of sits as the linchpin in that, right? If Taiwan is somehow reabsorbed into China, that really complicates the U.S. security relations with treaty allies of Japan and the Philippines. So that kind of security position is really important. And then lastly, Taiwan is now a increasingly mature democracy. And this complicates factors. The parties have gone back and forth, the two main parties, over control of the presidency. The current DPP president is Tsai Ing-wen, somewhat of a moderate, but has expressed positions that Beijing regards as provocative, at least relative to her predecessor. No matter what slide deck I'm presenting, I always put this picture up. Even if we're sharing family pictures about Europe trips, my family gets subjected to this. This is a survey of the Taiwanese population asking, who are you? What's your national identity? And kind of thinking about the national narratives that Putin's talking about and the rise in Ukrainian nationalism just as exemplars of how important nationalism is, right? And how you define that nationalism. The green line from 1992 at 17% represents the portion of the population that says, I am solely Taiwanese. The blue line, 25% down to rounding error today, and this is updated through 2021, is solely Chinese, right? And then the purple is both. And so what that tells you is, and we can talk as much about the domestic politics of this as you'd like, but what you've got is a democracy where both parties need to appeal to that in this year, is it 62%? 62.3% of the population who view themselves as primarily Taiwanese. In this earlier period, you could have at least one of the parties appeal to the portion of the population who focus more on their Chinese roots and their connection to the mainland. And again, there's a lot of history in there that I'd be happy to talk about in Q&A. And that made that a viable political strategy, but that's not a viable political strategy for either party, either the historically more pro-Beijing or certainly the more pro-independence minded. And so while democracy is a wonderful thing, of course, and the freedom and development of political institutions in Taiwan has been notable, and I think really transformative and serves as a wonderful model for Beijing, for the rest of Chinese cultural political entities. This is going to complicate matters. And the reason it's going to complicate matters is we're tied in, and China's position is pretty severe on Taiwan. What is China's position? China's position is Taiwan is a province of China. It was in the Qing dynasty, or at least late in the Qing dynasty. It was ripped away by the Japanese during World War II. And so its continued severance from the mainland is a reminder of the humiliations that the Chinese felt as a result of Japanese imperialism. It's also a reminder of the U.S. interference in Chinese affairs when we put the 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Strait at the outbreak of the Korean War. So it's a sense of historic accuracy from the Chinese perspective that Taiwan be reincorporated. And there's certainly a number of diplomatic statements that were made at the end of World War II and even through the 1970s that suggested that the U.S. was kind of in agreement with that perspective. For those of you who've been to Taiwan and been to the mainland, culturally, yeah, it is Chinese, right? It's Confucian, the same language. In fact, it's a more pure version of the written language than they use on the mainland. So in some sense, it is Chinese. The Chinese aren't drawing this out of thin air. Most of the world accepts that view. That is China's view that Taiwan is part of China. I couldn't get, really washed out. I couldn't get a super up-to-date map. This was from 3 years ago, and it's flagging, as at least those of you in the front will see, the countries that recognize Taiwan instead of China. China only lets you recognize one or the other. They're going to sever relations if you have a diplomatic relationship with Taiwan. So these are not geostrategic powerhouses. Haiti, Belize. Since this map was made, Nicaragua, Kiribati, and Solomon Islands have all switched over to recognizing China. So out of the 190 odd nations, Taiwan today has 13 countries and the Vatican that recognize Taiwan as a country. And even there, what geographic boundaries does that country control? Some of that gets a little wrapped up in the historic narrative that the Taiwanese would tell themselves that they were going to retake the mainland at the end of the Civil War. So this is not a recipe for a productive diplomatic future. And obviously, the U.S., which is here on this washed out map, does not recognize Taiwan as a country. So China, kind of has the world on its side when it says Taiwan is rightfully ours, right? Now, why do they have it on their side? Economic leverage certainly plays a huge role, and we can kind of come to that in a second. Again, from China's perspective, this situation of Taiwan as a strategic linchpin. I like this map because it turns things around, and it's kind of how Beijing would look out at the Pacific, right? Where they're really feeling very hemmed in by those U.S. alliance relationships on the left side of the map of Japan, and on the right side with Philippines, and then Taiwan, who we arm and train with, sits right in the middle. So, China has been long an advocate for reunification, one way or the other, and this in the wake of normalization in the 1970s, the Chinese stopped shelling the outer islands of Taiwan. Taiwan is constituted by the main island that was on that very first map, but then also a number of small islands right up against the Chinese shore that would be on the receiving end of shelling through the 1950s and 1960s. So they've moved away from that, and really the bulk of their policy to try to lead to reunification in the last 30 years, or 40 years since economic reforms began in China, is economic enticements. Right? As China becomes, again, 70% of the U.S. economy, they've got a lot of economic leverage to offer to Taiwan. Of late, they've also, because they've been very successful at developing a trading relationship with Taiwan, they've also been able to use economic coercion, right? So typically, China doesn't engage in the very public, formal, legalistic sanctions that we are putting in place vis-a-vis the Russians today. China would instead cancel all tourism to Taiwan, or stop importing Taiwanese pineapples and apples, both of which have occurred in recent years, but they don't declare it publicly so that you can't be pushed around in the WTO, and it's a little bit easier to walk away from that. So that set of policies has become more used as China's economy enables that to be used, right? As China gets to be wealthy and Taiwan trades quite heavily with China, then that leads to the creation of that toolkit, which Beijing has used. China's also engaged in kind of lobbying, would be the nice way of putting it, or interfering in domestic affairs of Taiwan, although they wouldn't use the domestic affairs. So this is, disinformation, whether it's on social media or through Beijing-led media that's aimed to influence Taiwanese discussions about their election campaigns. The Taiwanese have been very good at identifying that and calling it out as such. The Taiwanese and the Australians have both been very good, and so I think as that set of tools becomes something we continue to worry about, we're going to want to look to these two more frontline states to see how they have dealt with it. It didn't make much of an effect may have even backfired on Tsai Ing-wen's re-election a couple of years ago, but certainly is a tool that they're using. But then obviously the map is highlighting, the military toolkit as important. And the Ukraine issue reminds us, the Ukraine invasion, we're not in Moscow, I can say that word, the Ukraine invasion reminds us that great powers sometimes make use of their military capabilities regardless of whatever international norms that violates. So the Chinese have developed a set of capabilities that I could talk about at length that really complicate our ability to intervene if we so choose. And I'll come to U.S. policy in just a second here. The map here is depicting radar ranges in the purple and the gray and the yellow, sorry, not radar ranges, missile ranges in those three different color bands. And basically China can put at risk U.S. carriers deploying certainly within the Taiwan Strait, but also anywhere well to the west of the Taiwan Strait, such that U.S. F-35s and F-18s are going to struggle to spend much time flying in and around the Taiwan Strait to defend Taiwan, if that's what we want to do, right? And we're all thinking a lot more about what a no-fly zone means and what are the escalatory implications of that because of contemporary events. You're going to have that same issue set there. This set of capabilities has gotten much more pronounced. And again, I'm happy to talk about it at length. Some of it you've seen in newspaper coverage, but my students and the people I work with at Indo-PACOM just see a fundamentally shifted military balance. Taiwan in the 1990s would have been able to prevent an amphibious invasion of the island using its own forces. Today, at least on the basis of people who have lots of stars on their shoulder talking to the media about classified war games, so I'm just going to summarize their media comments. We lose war games over Taiwan routinely now. That's if we make the decision to intervene. So that's a massive change. Okay, let me then just kind of the third piece of this very simple puzzle, is the U.S. relationship, which again has evolved over time. We abandoned the alliance a few years after Nixon goes to China, but never completely sever ties. So there's this elaborate catechism of documents that lay out the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, the three communiques, the Taiwan Relations Act, all of which date from the 1970s, or all but one date from the 1970s, the 6 no policies of assurance to Taiwan about how we're going to continue to provide support, even though we've withdrawn our ambassador and torn up the treaty that we had signed with them. And on through to today, the 1992 consensus that laid out a pattern for Taiwan to meet with the mainland informally outside of diplomatic channels. So there's a lot of this diplomatic negotiation that has developed over time. And where does that leave the U.S. policy, right? We don't recognize Taiwan in the same way that we would recognize another country, but we don't say it's not a country. We say that we will oppose any unilateral attempt to change the status quo across the Taiwan Strait. What is the status quo across the Taiwan Strait? Well, it's more or less self-governing on the island, and Taiwan and China saying we plan on reunification at some point. That even defining that status quo is rather challenging. So A, we oppose unilateral changes to the status quo, and B, we do not support Taiwanese independence. And there's a bunch of other we do not supports. But notice that do not support Taiwanese independence is not the same thing as saying we oppose Taiwanese independence, right? And so if you read the documents really carefully, kind of the best summary is that the U.S. views Taiwan status as undetermined as yet, and it should be resolved peacefully, and usually we say in accordance with the wishes of both sides of the Taiwan Strait. That is, we have historically given China some legitimacy at the table to talk about what the final status of Taiwan would be. Again, historically that's been the case. So the Taiwan Relations Act, was passed over Carter's veto threat back in the 70s as we were tearing up the alliance, and it commits us to maintain the capabilities to come to Taiwan's aid if we so choose. And it says we would view any violent attempts to attack Taiwan as a grave threat to the peace and stability of the Pacific. That's not the same thing as an Article 5 commitment, right? Again, this relationship between Ukraine not being in NATO and therefore being subject to a different category of security assurances than Poland, for instance. Taiwan's in another nebulous category. They're not a treaty ally, not since 79 or 1980. They're not even recognized. We don't have a formal ambassador, although we do have something that looks like an embassy and somebody who had an ambassadorial rank from a previous post in a position that is equivalent to that. So that kind of, that commitment is ambiguous. Our end goal is also ambiguous. It's mostly we oppose things, not that we are directly outlining our positive vision for the relationship. But then I find this kind of bottom point. Since the Trump administration, but through a good year and a bit of the Biden administration, we've gradually moved towards more official connection with the Taiwanese. We had long sold them weapons, even after the ending of the alliance. The big F-16 sale got the Chinese attention in 1992, another one in the last couple of years, and kind of constant weapon supplies in the intervening period. Lo and behold, when you sell high-end weapons to a military like Taiwan's, you've got to at least train them how to use them. So Taiwanese pilots would come to Luke Air Force Base in the United States and train how to use their F-16s, right? Again, akin to the MiG-29 discussion that we've been having. But we've gone further than that in the last couple of years. So it was announced in 2019 that the U.S. had active duty trainers, Marine special operators on the ground in Taiwan, beyond the Marine Guard, which wasn't even acknowledged before about 2015. So we've got boots on the ground in a country that we don't recognize. And China has typically regarded any reinvigoration of the alliance, I saw that coming. Any reinvigoration of the alliance as a casus belli, as a grounds to go in and invade. So that is worrisome. We've also had higher and higher level visits from U.S. Diplomats, people from State Department, cabinet officials going to Taiwan. We had the Taiwan equivalent of an ambassador attend, BK Xiao attend Biden's inauguration. Again, a slight elevation of the diplomatic engagement. All of which seems perfectly moral and ethical. It's a democracy. 24 million people. They too have gotten dramatically wealthy by dint of their own hard work and political stability, especially in the democratic era. But it interacts with the Chinese policies that we chose to accommodate to achieve security gains in the late Cold War. And the real question is, how much are we willing to sacrifice if things escalate? So, prediction is difficult. I don't know if that's Yogi Berra or Mark Twain or not a four. Yogi Berra is the preferred one, I think. But the contest, Taiwan has essentially become a bipartisan issue in the United States, just as the Ukraine has, right? Nobody in Congress calls for a distancing of our relationship with Taiwan. So I think U.S. domestic politics are going to continue to pull us towards working more closely with Taiwan, and in part connected to China's policy on the Ukraine, but in part connected to a broader narrative in the U.S. about the rise of the authoritarian partners of Moscow and Beijing. There's a unitary view about China as being an implacable adversary that I think is wrong, but I think it's bipartisan in Washington. So that, coupled with the domestic politics in Taiwan, coupled with the rise of China, this creation of new set of capabilities that they have, makes me really worried. Now, it's not that I'm worried about war happening tomorrow, but I am worried that the next Taiwanese president might declare independence in a new way. There are a variety of different statements that the Chinese criticize that have already been stated, but something like a referendum that would be called in Taiwan could lead to very bad outcomes. And this would be a really horrific war. In some ways, assuming the U.S. gets involved, which I think is a safe assumption, I can't imagine the headlines on CNN and Fox that say, commie red China invades market democracy former ally Taiwan. I can't imagine that happening without us getting involved. But then we're very quickly getting to the discussions that we're talking about in the Ukraine context. China has today 100 nuclear weapons that can reach the United States. DoD has, the Department of Defense has projected that will double in 5 years. I think that's right. Much smaller arsenal than the Russians, who have about 5,000, but nevertheless, a couple of nuclear weapons really makes for a bad day, right? So that's at the high end, but just as we're talking about in the Ukraine, there's a lot of crisis management to keep it from escalating to that level. But the crisis management in a wartime situation with China is going to be much harder, because if I go back to my maps, right, it's all water, right? So you're going to have ships who are very vulnerable, right? Who when they go down, a carrier is going to lose 5,000 American sailors, or a destroyer is going to lose 300, and ditto on the Chinese side, right? Slightly smaller numbers. So I think you're likely to have large numbers of ships being sunk very early in the war, and sunk by U.S. missiles and Chinese missiles. The next stage of that war, that again is going to be very hard to avoid, are both sides saying we're losing a lot of our expensive and important assets to missiles coming out of the other side's territory. We need to take out those missiles. And on day 1 and day 3 and day 7, it's conventional strikes against those missiles. But this gets hard to disentangle from the nuclear concerns, right? Some of the missiles the Chinese have deliberately intermingled, just as we did in the Cold War, but we criticize them a lot for it now, as we should. And so that's going to make that kind of escalation management really, really difficult. So on the high end, I think the war, a war that breaks out would just be absolutely horrible. Second point, though, while there's probably not a deadline. Sometimes you'll hear people say Xi Jinping has announced a deadline for 2027 as when he wants to be able to take Taiwan back. He did announce that 2027 was an important deadline for military modernization, but not necessarily for using that military capabilities against Taiwan. Of course, they'll have more capability in 27 and in 28 and in 29, but I don't think that's the same thing as a deadline. It also coincides with the potential end of his next term, assuming he gets the third term this fall, which I think is a clear expectation that we all have. It's going to do the thing again where it's going to go to sleep. But I do think that the Chinese are probably starting to be in a position where they might think about closing windows. And if you think that your chances for whatever policy achievement are getting worse over time, you might engage in risk-taking, right? And so why might the Chinese think that the windows are closing now? One might be the U.S. has finally made some shifts in military doctrine that I'd be happy to talk about that I think are going to complicate China's strategic calculus. The Taiwanese, especially after Ukraine, I think will be making some of the same sorts of policy moves. Secondarily, the Chinese economy is no longer growing as fast as it was, but most of my career, they would have double-digit growth rates, often double-digit even after inflation, growing at 12% in real terms, right? And we're happy with 3% in real terms. Now they're hoping for 5.5% next year before inflation, and that is probably too high. They're probably not going to get that. So those might both push China to kind of engage in some risk-taking sooner rather than later. there are many ways to engage in salami slicing, but what I would expect is not that large war, at least not initially, right? All those little islands in the middle of the Taiwan Strait or up against the Chinese coastline that are ruled by Taiwan are highly vulnerable. And so just as China has poured a lot of concrete in islands that it took in the 1970s and 1980s in the South China Sea, you could imagine them kind of engaging in lower level provocations about those islands. It's not non-violent provocations, and I think the danger of unanticipated escalation there is also significant and will require really close coordination between the US and Taiwanese military, which is really hard because we don't recognize them as a country and we don't have many US forces there. And then kind of finally, Ukraine lessons, right? Whether you're thinking about the degree to which the West especially, and developed world especially, sided with the Ukrainians. Right? The Chinese would point out, and the Indians and Russians would point out, that 70% of the world's population either abstained or voted with the Russians in the UN, either General Assembly or other UN votes. But at least the West, the rich countries, and Japan and South Korea, came together, remarkably well. And the Chinese will be watching that and learning from that, both as how do we immunize ourselves from sanctions, but also how does this complicate our relationship with Europe, which had been a priority, let alone the United States. So that's kind of one issue. Authoritarian militaries, right? Part of the story about why the Russian military isn't doing as well is the cruise missiles aren't hitting the targets, morale with a conscript army is low, joint operations are hard. All of those problems map over very well to the Chinese, and they know it. And then tactics, right? Small, survivable systems can immunize or at least greatly reduce your vulnerability to expensive things like Su-27s that the Chinese have in the hundreds. So I think there are a lot of lessons for the region that can be somewhat positive, but all that has to be put alongside the use of military force to change borders in Europe in a way that we just haven't seen, absent the more modest attempts in 2014. We haven't seen that in Europe, and that certainly is going to contribute to kind of Beijing's thinking about this. So that's kind of all I've got. I'm certainly happy to go into any of that in more detail, but also to shift topics. I teach a lot on Chinese foreign policy, so if there are other areas that you would like to kind of get out on the table, I'd be happy to engage in those as well. Thank you for your attention.
Raise your hand. Liz will come by. She'll hold the microphone for you, and we've got plenty of time. Sure.
Okay. Thank you very much. A very interesting talk. Do you think that the Chinese have learned any lessons from Hong Kong, takeover of Hong Kong?
I don't think they regard that as particularly a unsatisfactory outcome. I think they would have liked to have not had to do that, but as we were sort of talking about at lunch, Hong Kong is just much less important to them. It was really important in the 80s and 90s as a bit of connective tissue to the West. But as after WTO accession and the development of kind of stock markets that in Shenzhen and Shanghai, that particular role was less important for China to depend on, and so losing it was less costly. Not zero cost, but the sanctions were kind of trivial in that case. Hong Kong's relevant in a couple of ways, though. One, the Chinese have foolishly doubled down on the one country, two systems slogan as a descriptor for their policy towards Taiwan. There's some hints that they may be moving away from that in the last couple of weeks, maybe a month and a half, but for the most part they've said, no, we want to reunify with Taiwan under the one country, two systems model. And if we go back to that chart, not that one, but if we go back to my PR chart, oh, I'm not going to be able to get it. To the polls, one of the big upticks is with Hong Kong, right? That's when you see the divergent identities, right? The Taiwanese are not interested in one country, two systems. And so you would have thought that there could be some learning there, and maybe we're starting to see that, but it's been pretty modest. And then, just the only other point to highlight is Hong Kong's very different than Taiwan. It was never self-governing. And I think, the model presented by Hong Kong within the PRC was profoundly threatening to the government in Beijing. Why can we have demonstrations on the streets in Hong Kong but not in Shenzhen across the border? In a way, that's the positive thing from my perspective as a lowercase d Democrat for the continued independent existence of Taiwan. Is it shows that there is nothing culturally Chinese that is incompatible with democracy. It's a political choice that the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, has made. Great, thanks for bringing up Hong Kong.
Can you give us an idea of the military capabilities of the Chinese army? I know they're vast in numbers, but they've been involved in relatively minor skirmishes and nothing like a full-scale invasion of something like of Taiwan, not to mention all the supply chain issues that go with that.
So, the Chinese have developed some very modern capabilities that we need to take seriously. They have tested missiles hitting ships at sea successfully at long ranges. And so that's critical for the US, right? Well, this isn't a bad one, but let's go back a couple. The US needs to fly from Guam, Okinawa, or from carriers to be able to contest the Chinese. And so long-range, accurate missiles, probably ballistic, but some cruise, are an important part of their strategy. And they've invested in that steadily throughout, even going back to the communist era. That was always a strong suit for them, relatively speaking. But those systems, I think, are quite capable. Now, it is interesting that the Russian cruise missile failure rate is as high as it is. But I don't expect that to be the same for the Chinese, or I wouldn't count on it. Other sets of capabilities that are also super capable, submarines, very quiet diesel submarines, smaller number of nuclear-powered submarines, but lots of diesel submarines that are a real threat, again, to U.S. carrier battle groups in the region. The Chinese Navy in general, more ships than the United States has. Not necessarily more capital ships. They've historically had a lot of smaller ships, coastal patrol vessels. But even now, they've got of their most modern destroyer, a big 300-person vessel carries 80 missiles on it or so. They've built 14 of the current variant, and I think that variant, at least my Navy students would tell me, that's as good as our cutting-edge destroyers do. Now, my suspicion is some of the systems integration and the radar and the comms aren't quite as good, but it's starting to get pretty close. And then air power, I already mentioned, hundreds of kind of current generation aircraft, just as the Russians are flying over the Ukraine today. Also fifth generation, that is stealthy aircraft. Probably, again, not as good as a F-22, but a lot of capabilities there. Strategic bombers like a B-52 that we make great use of, right, in delivering munitions, either standoff, if you've got an adversary still flying, or with SAMs, surface-to-air missiles, or over Afghanistan in a different set of circumstances. So the Chinese will find ways to use those systems productively too. So those nuts and bolts are easy to count. Your question, I think, was framed correctly in, well, they don't have a lot of experience, right? The Russians actually did have a fair amount of experience relative to anybody other than us in the last 20 years, and the Chinese don't. The Chinese haven't fought any significant conflict since 1979. There was a small naval skirmish in the 80s. And so I think that's going to be a real problem for them. They talk a lot more now than they did 10 years ago about joint training, but talking joint training and actually implementing it, again, that's something my students don't like doing. We really got to arm twist them to talk across services and to work together effectively. That's just going to be really hard in the Chinese system. The Chinese system is heavily stovepipe bureaucracy across the board, to include in the military. So I am kind of suspicious of that. But what I think is most worrisome is not a successful amphibious invasion of the main island of Taiwan. I think that, although if they try it, it's going to be really bloody, and I worry about escalation, right? But I think what's more likely would be those smaller island grabbing or a coercive campaign, which honestly we didn't really see in the Russian case, of lobbing lots of missiles against Taiwanese either defense sites or communication sites. And closing down all of Taiwan's airfields, right? It's a relatively small geography. And the Chinese have built up those missiles that we were looking at earlier. Where are my missile ranges? There. No, that's not it. Oh, well. The shorter range systems, they've got 1,500 weapons that can reach Taiwan. They've got probably 500 that could reach U.S. bases in Okinawa, and that's enough to kind of close down air bases and then give you air dominance. So then you can follow up with just more air power, which again in the Ukrainian case we haven't seen as much of. There has been much less strategic air bombing in the Ukrainian case than I would expect in the Chinese case, and I think that we might have expected in the Ukraine case. And I think the reasons are political, specific to the Ukraine-Russian conflict, and I'm not sure we'd see that in the Chinese case. And there's not much we can do about that, right? Missile defense is not going to work against hundreds of incoming missiles. Missile defense might work if you can figure out that's a nuclear missile coming at me and I'm going to launch 3 or 4 interceptors at it, but that's not the situation we're talking about. So I think that kind of capability, there's not much we can do about. Does it serve a political end for them? One hopes not.
You answered part of my question in there, but one issue I've seen is that it's fairly, China could destroy Taiwan, China could destroy the economy, taking is another issue. And so I agree the small islands sort of coming in, assuming the small stuff first would be a danger.
Yeah.
But in terms of the actual existential threat to Taiwan, China has only a few transport ships, assault ships, they've never done it. You didn't mention the war in 1979 in Vietnam. They got beat fairly badly. Okay, so do you see a danger of them going out and essentially destroying Taiwan if they can't take it? And then you talk about the advanced chip factories they'd like to have, a whole bunch of factors like that. I'd be curious what you see as sort of the big danger to Taiwan at this point.
So those are two separate and really important independently issues. That is how the Taiwanese high-tech integration with the global economy and with China affects Chinese thinking about destroying the village to save the village from the Vietnam era, right? On the one hand, and then on the other hand, kind of what's the military strategy and the interaction between the military toolkits that Taiwanese and China has. Yes, they have not historically been building up a large amphib fleet. That's starting to change. So that's an important indicator and warning. And at the rate that they build destroyers, that could be a very different situation in 5 years.
100-mile strait with submarines and...
Right, so today, yeah, you don't have the amphibious invasion threat, but you do have all these other coercive threats to worry about. And in 5 years, we may have to add the amphibious threat in there. On that supply chain, and then on the military side as well, the Taiwanese lessons from Ukraine are also going to be large, but we don't know how they're going to learn them, right? And so for my whole career, the United States has been encouraging Taiwan to do what the Ukrainians are doing now, right? To have lots of very survivable systems that can be distributed out so that when you lose your very expensive F-16s, your very expensive naval destroyers on day one of the war, which I think they're very likely to lose in the first few days, that's not the end of the game, That's not the end of the war. The Taiwanese have been very reluctant to do that for their own, internal bureaucratic cultural reasons, right? The Navy captains want to be in charge of a big blue water fleet ship that they can sail out and lead the flotilla. The Air Force pilots want to fly F-16s rather than drones and manage surface-to-air missile systems. So I think there is a lot of organizational culture that has really held Taiwan back, and a very thin silver lining on this horrible cloud over Europe today in the last month is, bearing witness to that can be an effective strategy, buying a lot of Stingers. The problem is anti-ship cruise missiles are not the same size as anti-tank, so it's somewhat different systems, but the principle remains the same. And then on this economic issue set, China has been, you may have heard the term dual circulation. They're trying to implement a new set of economic policies to focus a little bit more on managing innovation at home and developing technologies at home, so that they aren't as dependent on the US, so that they're not subject to Huawei and ZTE sanctions, if you recall, in the Trump administration, which really caused them caused those two firms significant problems. They haven't achieved much yet, and Taiwan is one of the largest suppliers of chips, in the world. Higher up in the supply chain, you end up with European firms providing the lithography machines for the Taiwanese chips, but China's just way down at the bottom. And whether you measure it in terms of the nanometer separation in a chip fab, the Chinese are 2 or 3 generations behind the Taiwanese, and the best Chinese factories are often owned by Foxconn, a Taiwanese firm. So that kind of separation will be extremely costly for the mainland, but they're clearly for a variety of reasons, right? To avoid the middle income trap, to avoid that continued slowing of economic growth. They're trying to develop more technology at home, and that'll have a byproduct of reducing that cost over time. What is my big worry at the end of the day? My big worry at the end of the day is either Xi Jinping or a successor cohort faces such slow growth at home, so much unhappiness with internal repression, which has gotten dramatically worse than when my wife and I first went in the 90s. Well, maybe it's not worse than the 90s, but it's worse than the 2000s when we traveled there. And slow growth and huge income inequality problems within the cities, let alone urban and rural problems. All of this comes home to roost in nationalism, right? The Chinese say we need to complete the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation and finally end the century of humiliations, and that has to be done with Taiwan. That's my worry, and you certainly see signs in social media and elsewhere of an uptick in nationalism in China. And I think one of the dark implications of the Ukraine is, as China has leaned gently to the Russian side, not completely, they're not sending them weapons, but they're definitely leaning, that facilitates that narrative of the West as the enemy, and makes it easier for that next nationalist narrative. Maria, are you going to give the next lecture?
You talk about the window is closing fast on China, and you worry about possible military aggressive reaction to take opportunity of this narrowing window. But what about the other possibility as the window is closing, and that is to seek more diplomatic accommodation with the West? After all, China really did not want or does not want to be a pariah state. And China is best served by a stable world rather than a world in conflict. So what are the opportunities?
I think there are opportunities there, but this is what disturbs me so much about the Chinese reaction to the Ukraine crisis. Right? They are putting themselves in a position where they are both tacitly supporting, not actively, but tacitly supporting destabilization of the global economy. Right? I mean, the Chinese import a ton of grain. They're going to get hit very hard. They're not going to make their 5.5 rate because of the disruptions in the grain market coming out of the Ukraine and Russian exports. So they haven't chose the path of stability in that case. So that kind of raises some questions. But the broader point that you're making, I think, is I agree with. the way I would put it is, there are elements in Chinese foreign policy that are not Putinesque, right? Taiwan is the only one that is really deeply, I think, problematic. And so I think it is important to try to find ways to talk to the Chinese as something less than a complete and unmitigatable adversary over issues like climate change, which we did rather successfully just a few months ago, 6 months ago. JCPOA, the agreement with the Iranian, about Iranian denuclearization or freezing of the nuclear program. Chinese were constructive again. North Korea, we need to have a conversation with them about that. All of that is complicated by narratives, again, speaking in my personal capacity, narratives that come out of the DoD that say China, Russia, China, Russia, China, Russia, China, Russia. Right? There are times where you might want to say that, but they're different, right? The countries act very differently, and I think trying to draw the Chinese out so that the benefits of not finding themselves in the situation that the Putin regime is going to be in, for at least as far as I can foresee, continues to look plausible. But part of what that means is the U.S. not crossing China's red line of accepting Taiwan as a completely independent country. The best we can do is kick the can down the road. But if we kick the can down the road another 20 years, right, things may have improved in a significant way in the mainland or in others. So that's kind of, I think, the best we can hope for. And promoting additional recognition of Taiwan, right? The map where you got Kiribati and Solomon Islands and Guatemala as the allies. I'd love to find an animation of that across time, because the trend line is fewer and fewer countries recognizing Taiwan. I agree that's annoying and kind of offensive, but that doesn't compromise Taiwan's ability to exist. I want to have a project with the Taiwanese Foreign Ministry. What happens when the last country changes recognition? Do you disappear? No, you go on the way you were before. You've got trade missions, you've got informal diplomatic ties. And so I think, not focusing on the trappings of formal diplomatic engagement and recognition certainly has some costs, but I think it avoids getting too close to that red line. It avoids China feeling like the window is closing and they better do it now, or the U.S. is about to recognize them, or we're about to send the SecDef to Taiwan to coordinate the next big exercise, or so on. Tough issues.
My question is about European countries or European Union. What is their stand with respect to Taiwan? And are they also as cautious about China as they were about, for example, the gas issue with Russia? Or are they going to be having a united front with the U.S.?
Again, if we went back a year and a half, we would have described China's outreach to the Europeans as being quite successful, especially to the Eastern Europeans and Central Europeans. One thing I didn't talk about at all, because it's not relevant to Taiwan, is the Belt and Road Initiative. But more generally, it's just Chinese outbound investment, right? Just as the Japanese did in the 1970s and 1980s, China now invests a lot elsewhere and builds up factories, roads, dams. They've signed a number of deals with Greece, with Hungary, and so I think, again, up till about a year and a half ago, China would have said our engagement with parts of the European Union has been pretty positive, and it helps to create a multipolarity in the world that is viewed beneficial to Beijing. Anything that dilutes U.S. hegemonism or unipolarity, China is willing to support. Since then, the Europeans finally kind of got very offended about the Uyghur, suppression of the Uyghurs, the Muslim population in the Xinjiang area of China, and passed some resolutions criticizing, the EU kind of passed resolutions criticizing China, and then that led to the beginnings of some ruptures on the economic front. So I think there's been some change, and you're certainly seeing that accelerated by the Ukrainian crisis with the slight lean that China is providing is viewed very problematically by Europeans. And so the Chinese are, again, I think shooting themselves in the foot, both to this kind of point of benefiting from the open access to a relatively stable economy, and in particular to developing relations with Europe. Things haven't gone so well. There have also been, over the last 5 years, stepping back a little bit, some more military displays, not quite the same freedom of navigation operations that the U.S. does, which are inside of 12 nautical miles of a Chinese feature in the South China Sea, fairly provocative. But nevertheless, are shows of force. And so you've had the French, the Germans, and the Brits all send a ship or two to pass through the Taiwan Strait or to drive through the South China Sea, just as a signal that Chinese behavior is viewed as going a little too far in some of those areas. So I think you're starting to see a wedge there. But just as I mentioned a little bit earlier, just to kind of finish on this thought, right? India is voting with China. The Indians and the Chinese foreign ministers just had a meeting in the last 3-4 days. A lot of African countries have not voted with the United States in the UN. So yes, we may have Europe, and they're rich. We may also have Japan and South Korea to varying degrees, but it's not a unified coalition on either the Taiwan issue or more generally on kind of challenging China and the challenge China poses to us.
If I can use my position to ask the last question. And in this scenario, I'm imagining President Biden invites you to the White House.
Happens all the time, yeah.
Absolutely. I know I'm trying to give away anyway. And he says, I am terrified of a much bigger, more dangerous version of Ukraine happening in Taiwan. And I heard your World Affairs Council talking. You're absolutely right. The best thing to do is kick the can down the road 20 years because we're not going to solve the Taiwan issue now. So he asked you, what are the things that we need to be doing differently, proactively, or that we're doing and we shouldn't be doing, to make sure, as best we can, that there won't be another Ukraine issue, but this time involving Taiwan, at least for the next 4 or 5 years. What would you tell them to do or not to do?
So one of the statements that came out after last week's Xi Jinping and Biden virtual summit was a U.S. statement that, again, a kind of a reiteration of the Taiwan policy that we don't support Taiwan independence. So I would keep doing that, but it was also coupled with we don't, a few statements kind of along the lines of we don't intend regime change in China, we don't view competition as inherently conflictual. So I would continue those sorts of statements. The language came out in the Chinese write-up of the bilateral summit, not in the U.S. I would make sure it's in the U.S. unless you were misquoted, but if you were misquoted, they would have come out and corrected that. So I suspect Biden said something along those lines, but didn't want to tout it. I think he should tout it. That would be kind of one issue, to try to reassure China that we are not actively trying to promote a color revolution within China. If it naturally happens, that's one thing, but our policy is not to foment such a social revolution. Two would be, and we do this to some degree, but to continue to try to carve out some, quote, international space for Taiwan, right? If you've only got those 14 allies who have diplomatic recognition, it's really hard to engage the international community informally, formally, excuse me. But I think we ought to try to create that international space informally, right? Taiwan is going to be subject to Chinese economic coercive sanctions again, I'm sure. So will South Korea, Japan, Australia, probably the United States. Why not have an informal grouping, not a formal trade pact, but an informal grouping of, yeah, if you guys are being boycotted by China on Taiwanese pineapples, we're going to all buy some more pineapples, right? That sort of pooling of risk against Chinese economic coercion in a way that doesn't provoke by making it a formal kind of diplomatic engagement. And then third, stop selling them F-16s. We keep selling them these very expensive weapons that are not going to be useful in most of the kinds of scenarios that I worry about. And it's, and I think to some extent this is going to solve itself. We're I'm sure ramping up Javelin, anti-tank missile lines right now. And again, some of the strategic changes that the U.S. has made in response to the Chinese military rise has meant we're thinking a lot more about how to attack ships from land outposts. That's something that we should not encourage the Taiwanese to do, but demand. Right? They're going to plunk down billions of dollars on a small number of submarines. That's again just a waste. Jeeps that can hide in forests and can shoot anti-tank missiles. That's what they need, or anti-air missiles. So those three kind of categories of diplomatic, language, economic, resiliency, and maybe some strategic redirection would be things I would propose.
Thank you very much. Christopher, that was just a wonderful talk, very informative, and just as a small token of our thanks, we'd like to give you a little liquid sunshine, since we don't put a lot right now, as a token of our thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you all. And don't forget, Doug Rogers, if you have any comments.